This is the Keys to the Shop Rate of Rise series brought to you by Roast Magazine. Today we're talking with Spencer Turer of Coffee Enterprises. Well, hey everybody, this is Chris DeFurio with Keys to the Shop. Welcome to another edition of Rate of Rise, elevated conversations on roasting, brought to you by Roast Magazine, which is one of the longest running and most respected trade journals in the coffee industry. And they have a new series called Roast Audio Articles, where they are presenting articles from Roast Magazine's archive that cover coffee from a technical perspective. So you get to keep up with the latest research, knowledge, and insights from scientists, subject matter experts, and professionals. And you can find that over at roastmagazine.com/audio articles. You should definitely be subscribing to Roast and exploring those great audio articles that you can listen to on your web browser and on SoundCloud. So again, go visit them over at roastmagazine.com/audio articles. Now, today we get the pleasure of talking with Spencer Turer, who wrote the article that's now an audio article, Quality Variations, Defining and Measuring Quality in Coffee from Production to Preparation. Spencer has been an integral part of the coffee industry since 1992. He's currently the vice president of Coffee Enterprises in Heinsberg, Vermont, and previously has held positions as general manager for Mitsui Foods, coffee specialist for Kerry Food and Beverage, supply chain manager and coffee technologist for Dunkin' Donuts, and so many more. Spencer is a member of the Technical and Regulatory Affairs Committee for the National Coffee Association. He's also an ambassador with the International Women's Coffee Alliance, and is on the Specialty Coffee Arbitration Panel for the Green Coffee Association. Spencer is an award-winning coffee taster and professional who's a certified Q grader, certified coffee tester, roaster, technician, instructor. I mean, you name it, Spencer has pretty much done it, and he's been doing this for over 25 years. He's highly published across the industry, and so again, I'm really excited to talk to Spencer, especially about this topic, because when you're talking about something as big as the idea of quality, you need somebody with the experience that Spencer has to be able to talk about it and break it down for you. And that's what we're doing today. Picking up where the article left off, we're going to be discussing the concept of quality, how we should think about it, how it applies practically to your roastery, first steps that you need to take to make quality control and quality assessment a real part of your operations, and a lot more. There are so many different facets of this conversation that we hit on in this interview, and I think that is really going to be beneficial to set you in the right direction to create a more profitable coffee roastery, to get higher quality products in the door to your roastery and in the cup to your customers. And I think that's a goal that we all have. So without any more from me, let's get right to my interview for the Rate of Rise series for February, talking all about quality with Spencer Turer. Well, Spencer, what a pleasure to have you on Keys to the Shop. Welcome. How are you doing?
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here. I've had lots of coffee, and I will try not to talk too fast.
It's okay if you do. There's a lot to talk about, so if we talk fast, we can cover it all. I think this topic is right up your alley, of course. We're kind of piggybacking on your article about quality at Roast Magazine. But the topic of quality, there are thousands of articles that could be written about it, and a conversation that we're going to have today is going to try to cover a broad spectrum of things. But I think the first question that I kind of want to get us started with about quality is not so much about what the definition of quality is, because that's such an open-ended question. It's like saying, what is sustainability? But right. What are the ways that we should be thinking about quality that will help us arrive at some kind of a useful conclusion? Because I know it's important to have more than one way to consider it, especially if you're looking to use that in your roastery. So how do you suggest that we start this and approach the topic?
Well, it's going to be hard to begin discussing quality at a single point, because it is a moving target. It's more, I look at it as a circular concept. It's not just scientific testing. It's really ingrained in the quality personality of the business, what it is that you want to be buying, what it is that you want to be selling. And it's really a set of tools to make sure that you are achieving what the consumer's looking for, what your customer's looking for, so they can have positive experiences. It's a control point. It's the science, not the artistry of coffee.
Okay. So it's science, and at the same time, there are different elements that impact quality as we understand it. So like you were saying, it's a moving target. So the question is, like, who sets up the specific expectations and, well, the specifications of that science? Because as humans, we're prone to be moving around in our emotions and the way we perceive things. So who is it or what is it that sets the specifications and expectations for coffee quality?
So let's start really in the middle. So as a coffee roasting company, let's talk about quality control for the roasted coffee product. And really that would be in the very beginning when you're an entrepreneurial startup, when you're a new company, or you're an existing company and you're trying to present a new product. What is it that you want to present to the consumer? And that's a loaded question because, is it what we want to sell to the consumer? Or is it looking backwards? What does the consumer want to buy from us? And really identifying what the variables are in the product and what the capacity and the capabilities of the equipment are so that you can then control what it is the product that you're designing so that the consumer can have a consistent product. Understanding roast development level, understand grind particle size level, understand moisture. There's a lot of things that go into quality and measuring the physical attributes of the product as well as the sensory attributes of the product, and making sure you have the right team in place to be able to measure the quality and manage and maintain it. But the starting point, Chris, that you said is who makes that determination? And when we're in small companies that have, very entrepreneurial staff where everybody's wearing different hats and doing different things, there's probably a small group of people, whether it's the owner who's also the buyer, who's also the roaster, who's putting everything together and making the decisions themselves, or the opposite end of the spectrum, where you have a large company and you have a quality assurance department that would be setting the standards and a separate quality control department, which would be testing and evaluating the products and adherence to those standards. There's probably a dozen different paths that you and I can go down on this topic, but it really boils down to what it is that you want to be selling, understanding what the variables are and making sure that you can control those variables so that you have a consistent product. The consumer wants coffees that look, smell, and taste their expectations. So that's really the starting point.
Okay, so diving into that a little bit further, you're setting the you're trying to get consistent coffee according to what your customers want, which means that you're sort of you're combining intrinsic and extrinsic values by saying, well, here is the potential of a Guatemalan coffee or, whatever, a very general term. But then there's the extrinsic expectations of the customer on that coffee. So it seems like you'd have to balance the industry influence on your thinking around a coffee versus the demand that your customers are putting on you. So it's difficult to know what to give more credibility to when you're assessing quality. Do you try to convince your customers that the intrinsic nature of this coffee is worth you changing your opinion about, or is it the other way around?
I think folks who are operating roasting companies are going to appreciate this comment when we say, because I lived this in my career when I was working in manufacturing. Is it that there's a push and pull between manufacturing and sales? There's the age-old argument: why can't the sales team sell what we make? And why can't the manufacturing team make what the sales team sells? I mean, that's trying to figure out what the products should be that go to the customer. That's product development, and that's really, there's a science behind it. There's consumer insights and research. It shouldn't necessarily be, I want to make the products that I like, because I don't know if I'm the roaster or I'm the QA guy or I'm the coffee buyer or the blender. I don't know if what I like translates into what the customers are going to buy. So there's a whole set of research tools and topics related to product development. But what you're talking about, intrinsic and extrinsic quality, I think of that more in the lines of the green coffee and on the green coffee supply chain. And, some of those topics we can think strategically and say, if I'm trying to sell a Guatemalan coffee, obviously my sourcing has to be 100% from Guatemala. If I'm looking to do a blend, I have the ability to look at different coffees from different origins. But when I'm thinking about intrinsic and extrinsic quality, or intrinsic quality and produced quality or manufactured quality, it's really what the coffee tells us as it's grown on the tree. And intrinsic quality is something that you really can't affect. What the varietal has, how the coffee is grown based on where the tree is planted, your longitude and latitude, the chalkiness or acidity of the soil, things like that is where I use that definition for intrinsic quality, because that's what comes off the plant. Everything else afterwards, in my definition, is kind of how I view it. That's your extrinsic. That's any of the outside influences that can be used to manipulate either positively or negatively the quality of that coffee as it goes through the supply chain to the roaster, and then through the roaster to the cafe, to the barista, their ability to change the quality or the sensory attributes or impact of that coffee based on how they're brewing it, based on how it's preparing. So you need to know, based on the product that you're looking to sell to the consumer, what the intrinsic quality has to be. So if it's country of origin, it's got to start with quality, with the country of origin that you're mentioning on the label. But, let's go a little bit deeper into that and say, when you're on the green coffee side and you're buying coffee and you're looking for a specific profile in mind. I'm looking for big bean. I'm looking for a specific flavor profile. I'm looking for coffees that are going to be fresh certain times of the year. Now you go back to the intrinsic. What countries are going to give me that? What varietals or cultivars are going to give me that? And understanding what it is, the product that you need to buy in order to get to that quality for the intrinsic attributes of what a coffee is. So, and I apologize, I tend to jump around a lot in some of these answers, because when we look at coffee, there's a strategic understanding, but there's also, when we're looking at different businesses and opportunities, there's the green coffee conversation, the manufacturing conversation, the roasted conversation, the barista and retail conversation, what's applicable to small companies or big companies. It's sometimes when we answer these questions, Chris, we're trying to identify what the right answer is based on the size and scope of the company that we're working with. So that's the reason why I jump around a lot. But let me throw it back to you and say, where specifically do you want to explore?
Well, I think that most of our audience is going to be occupying the space of mid-size roasters, maybe with a few retail locations. And so, but at the same time, I think it's it's fine if we bounce around a little bit, because a lot of the efficiencies and inspirations that small roasters get come from looking at larger roasters and saying, I think we can apply that to what we do. And it sounds like maybe it's ill fit sometimes if you're looking at a larger roasting operation and how they assess quality for what they're doing. To me, it feels like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my assumption would be the larger the company, the more there's a heavy focus on consistency and measuring those intrinsic qualities to make sure that you're going to get that. Whereas in smaller ones, I tend to see a wide variety of very novel flavors and processing methods, pushing the envelope type stuff, and it doesn't seem as safe for the large ones. So I think addressing both, as impractical as that sounds, would be good. I mean, maybe the question is, how do we decide which measures for quality are appropriate for us if we're at that mid-size level?
Okay, so let's talk about physical and financial risk, and let's do the supply chain, from top to bottom, upstream to downstream, and say, quality control should really be started with your green coffee purchasing, and your financial risk is, do I measure my green coffee deliveries or the type samples or the offer samples to see the value of the coffee? And am I measuring the arrival samples to ensure that I am getting what I'm paying for? Very often, and some of the impetus of the articles that I write for Roast Magazine are based on conversations that I have in the trade, learnings that I have in the trade, conversations with different people at different parts of the supply chain and different stakeholders to see what the questions are, and what difficulties people are having. So we look at, on the green coffee side, a lot of conversations were centered around, I'm only cupping the coffee. I'm only looking for coffee that tastes great. And I trust my suppliers to be able to give me what I'm looking for. But professionally, as a quality control person, I look at, we should be grading the coffee. We should be looking at the bean size. We should be looking at the moisture. So things that are going to affect the value of the coffee or affect the price of the coffee. If you're paying a premium for large bean size and small defect count, you want to make sure that that's exactly what you're receiving. So I'm going to take another step back, Chris, and say, I started out my professional career in culinary and as a culinary student going into food service. So I look at coffee the same way that a chef is looking at the foods that they are buying for a restaurant. I know what my recipes are. I know what has to go to the consumer. So I need to make sure that what's coming into my business is based on the physical and sensory attributes of what is necessary. And when we talk about quality, I spend a lot of time talking about the physical attributes because there is such a financial risk. I'm paying a premium. Am I not getting that premium? The physical risk comes out when we say, there's a specification in place, but the specification is not based on what you write in your contract or on your email with your green coffee supplier. Your specification specifically is what you're willing and able to accept. And if you accept coffees below what you specify in the contract, the real specification is what you accept, not what's written. So we want to make sure we protect the financial integrity of the businesses by saying, making sure you're getting what you're paying for. Okay. It should meet grade. And then it also should meet cup. It needs to taste great. If for some reason it doesn't taste the way that you're looking for, or there's some issues on the grade, quality control is measuring. It's not necessarily the commercial decision, the usability of the coffee. Quality control should be the independent testing. This is what it's presenting. And then in a medium-sized company, that would then go to the buyer and say, these are the attributes of the coffee. You should decide whether you accept it or reject it. You should decide if it's usable or unusable. But that's really the starting point of the whole process.
Okay, so the line that we don't cross is really what we're talking about. Like, what is a step too far for a lot of roasters? They say, well, it doesn't taste exactly like this lot was great last year, but this year it's not tasting as great. But it's not quite as bad as something we would say absolutely not to. So it's like, how do we? I know this is such an open question, but how do we set up our own expectations to know this is what we're accepting and not accepting, because we know we have so many tools available. Well, blending is probably the number one where we can say, we'll put it in a blend. But how much of that kind of aftermarket making up for that gap in quality is advisable when you're dealing with that financial risk?
So this is where, that's a great question, Chris, but this is where, in my opinion, when I'm looking at organizational structures, this is where quality control and purchasing and product development all work hand in hand. Again, in small companies, this may be one person putting it all together. In large companies, it may be 3 different people or 3 different teams. So understanding the acceptable variations or the minimum maximum for the different measurable standards for coffee. If it's a single origin coffee and it doesn't taste the way that you're looking for it to taste, your question is, what's the risk to the consumer? Do I buy it and do my best in roasting? Am I able to roast through any of that? Or if you can't possibly roast through it because maybe the acidity is not at the right level or the fruity component isn't what you're looking for, then your decision is, do I change the product to the consumer or do I reject it? Rejecting a coffee that meets your contract standards is really challenging, and understanding that any rejection is going to be expensive for anybody in the supply chain. That's where your purchasing department, your green coffee buyer, really needs to have a strategic plan of looking at all the coffees, every harvest, all the availabilities, having great relationships with the traders and the importers on, if something's not quite meeting my expectations, what is the flexibility to be able to meet that, to exchange those coffees, to change out the origins. In a medium, mid-sized company, maybe you have enough coffee in your inventory or enough coffee in your buying pattern that you can say, coffee A didn't meet my expectations. I can move it into this category, and there's another coffee that's coming up that will meet it, and I'll have some flexibility in my choices. That helps when you're working with blends, but doesn't help necessarily when you're working with single origin coffees. There are some tips and tricks on product development side and operational side, but from a quality perspective, one, the single decision is this acceptable or unacceptable? Then the secondary decision, as you pointed out, is really, if it's not exactly what I'm looking for, how do I work within my business options and my business operation to be able to decide how I can use this coffee? If it's defective, if there's contamination, there's ferment, there's phenolic, it's not supposed to be earthy, musty, but it is. Those are your, I can't use this coffee because it's defective. If it's just and this is a huge risk on our industry, and something we've been struggling with for 20 years is, if I expected the coffee to score an 85 and I scored it an 83, what do I do with it? And there's all kinds of topics and conversations on, scoring and the efficacy of scoring and alignment and calibrations and things like that. But it really comes down to a food product. It's your business. This is what's coming in the back door. Can you use it? How it is going to impact and affect the consumer experience? And now you're talking about the financial risk of your business.
Well said. I can't help but think about the tension between the conversations that you hinted at, where we're thinking about opening up the industry more to those 80s and low 80s scoring coffees as a way to say, look, we need to move more coffee so farmers can do more, was a sustainability topic, right?
Yes.
But then at the same time, we're forecasting somewhere down the road for the consumer, like, well, how does quality control fit into this? And am I simply, I don't want to say fooling myself, or am I simply being led down a path where eventually I'm not going to be using the quality control analysis that I use properly just for a particular value? Like, being able to bridge the gap between those two things and say, I want to have stringent standards, but how stringent is too stringent? And that's a really hard place for a professional to be right now.
All coffee will find a home. We always have to understand that every coffee that's grown at some point in time in the future will be used. And it's up to your individual roasting company, whether it's your quality control group or your purchasing group, to make sure that only the coffee that you want to enter your business enters your business. And I look at quality control kind of like a sociological view. You're measuring something, you're not really deciding if it's good or bad. You're just deciding if it's appropriate or inappropriate, if it's different or if it's the same. Because, when you look at it in those terms, you're looking for a coffee and something that comes in and it has much more acidity and much more body and much more complexity, and say, wow, this is better than I expected it to be. You say, that's great. I'm getting a deal because this is better coffee than I contracted for. But sometimes better is just as bad as not as good, because when you go put that coffee in front of the consumer and they're looking for your products to look, smell, and taste the same way every time, because we know in many instances, coffee being a ritualistic product, our consumers are drinking multiple cups a day, the same time every day, sometimes the same preparation method, sometimes with the same condiments and modifiers. And if something is different, they're going to peek up and say, ooh, there's something different on this. I don't necessarily like it because I wanted it to be the same. They're not looking for inconsistencies. If we take coffee out of that conversation and say, you go to your local pizza shop and the pizza this week was great and fabulous, and next week it wasn't as good. Do you expect that it's always going to be better or it's always going to be worse? Which is the standard and which is the variable? So we look at the understanding on the quality control is to make sure that of all the coffees that are available in the world and all the coffees that are coming into your business, or take the green coffee out of it, and all the coffees that are in your business, whether they're in your inventory and they're not yet roasted, quality control should always be looking at how long this coffee's been in my inventory. Is it aging well? Is it not aging well? What's happening with the moisture? What's happening with the water activity? And when I sample roast it again and cup it after it's been in the inventory for a couple of weeks or a couple of months, what's happening to the acidity? What's happening to the flavor attributes? Are we starting to get the papery, malty, cereal characteristics of staling, or is it holding up really well? Then you look at your work in progress. Are we testing the coffee out of the roaster? Are we testing the coffee out of the grinder? Are we testing the coffee as a finished product to the consumer? And then now that we have all this data that we've collected, Chris, and we say, what do we do with all this data? We have spreadsheets, we have notebooks of data, we have historical stuff going on. What do we do with this? And that's where quality control, the testing, goes up to quality assurance, the evaluation, the administration, and says, what is controllable? What is going to give us the indication on the front end of manufacturing that the finished product to the consumer is going to look, smell, and taste the way that it's supposed to? And by knowing what the finished product attributes are and looking at your process controls backwards, you can say, from a predictive situation, if my green coffee is this, if my inventory is this, if the coffee out of the roaster is this, it gives me the greatest opportunity to meet the product to the consumer. If these measured attributes at the beginning of the manufacturing cycle don't meet expectation, then the data is going to prove over historical information that it's not going to give you the product that you want to the consumer. So what we want to make sure is, and again, I do realize I'm jumping around a lot of different things, is in the very beginning, when a company is young and when you're developing your own quality control programs, and you're setting up, what equipment do I buy? How do I manage this? What do I test? My opinion is always, test everything in the very beginning, because you don't know moving into the future how important that data is going to be. Quality control testing is destructive testing. Once it's tested, it's hard to go back and retest. Once the product is through manufacturing to the consumer, you can't ever go back and recreate, and you can't guess. If I measure these attributes, let me guess what the other attribute was. And that's not appropriate. So you collect as much data as possible. You follow methods and protocols that are scientifically proven and peer reviewed and published. And then as your business matures, you use all that data and do trend analysis to see what's important, what do I need to continue to test so that I can manage my business in an efficient way. One, to protect the integrity of the consumer experience, but also to protect so I'm not losing money. Because really the question then becomes, from quality control, and this is the rub between quality control and operations. When quality control evaluates the coffee and says it's not within standard, it's not within specification, what do you do with it? And that's an operational question. And that's trying to understand what the risks are. Can it get reblended? Can it get reworked? Does it have to get thrown away? Does it get donated to a charity? Does it get flavored? Does it go into a economy blend and you can sell it at a lower price? Because what you don't want to do is have so many problems and have so many out of specification questions that you're spending so much time and resources and money trying to figure out how to sell your problems and not necessarily selling what you're supposed to be selling. So quality control, when it's done correctly, and the testing when it's done correctly, should help you eliminate the anomalies, help eliminate the bad roasts or the high moistures, or, making sure that any defective coffee never makes its way into your supply chain.
I love that. Selling your problems. It reminds me of a condiment bar. It just a more elaborate Rube Goldberg machine that turns your mistakes into sellable things, and just you get addicted to or very, very good and skilled at that thing. And it seems like it would rob a lot of energy and urgency from the energy and urgency you should put behind your quality control. And I was just thinking about how terrible it would be. You mentioned better is not always better. How you're not just wasting coffee in a sense. You're wasting first impressions and the opportunity to gain a customer, which is invaluable considering we need more people to be consistently buying coffee. So people will, you'll say, oh my gosh, this coffee tastes really good. And then you won't be able to replicate it because you didn't actually do any of that work with the data or the quality control, like you said. And I feel like sometimes people blame that, or not blame it, but they just kind of revel in the agricultural and finite nature of coffee. So if it changes year to year, I think we tend to blame the production of the coffee, or say, well, that's just the way coffee is. It's not going to be the same year to year. I mean, there's some truth in that, but is that kind of a crutch?
Wow, you just gave me 16 different questions, and I want to move those 16 questions into 32 different directions. So let's talk about this and say, comparing coffee as a food product to other food products. Yes, the consumer wants it to look, smell, and taste the same way every time. And that's a problem for us because coffee is an agricultural product. Coffee has a lot of variables, and we don't have the benefit that the wine industry has of selling a finished product from the farm and having the finished product based on vintage years and having all kinds of information available to wine consumers that says, this year's a great year, buy everything you can. And next year, maybe not so much. It's more going to be table wine, but the year after that's going to be fabulous. We don't have the benefit of the vintage years that wine has. So coffee, it tends to be, and unfortunately, I'm going to use a standard quality example. Is you go to the supermarket and it's in bags and cans and canisters, and it's marketed the same way the peanut butter is marketed, and it's marketed similarly to anything else in the supermarket. You can't necessarily see it unless you're buying whole bean in the old whole bean bins, but you're buying what is in effect something that you expect it to be similar. So we're hampered by that, and it challenges us. But now your linkage is to marketing, and I like to say that we sometimes do a disservice to our industry by exaggerating, by not really being authentic in how we're communicating coffees to the consumer. Because we have a terminology and vernacular that we use as professionals, but the consumers sometimes don't understand what we're saying or don't understand the meaning of what we're saying. And they're just going to smile and shake their head and say, okay, this is the one I'm going to buy. And they bring it home and hopefully they enjoy it. But really, from a business perspective, the promise of marketing establishes an expectation. And it's really easy to have a fabulous website and have wonderful packaging and tell a beautiful story and have pictures of where hopefully the coffee is actually grown from, not just stock photographs, and say, look how wonderful this is. And, you romanticize the coffee, and the consumer says, wow, this is a great story. And if there's a certification, maybe it's from, a woman-owned co-op, or it's organic, or there's other, Rainforest Alliance and the cute little frogs on the package. And they say, this is wonderful. I'm going to go bring it home and enjoy it. And the quality doesn't meet the expectation. And that's a problem for all of us because merchandising tells us you can buy the first sale. It's only the quality of the product that's going to get you the second sale. So when we talk about quality, and this is where I'm going to transition because I think you alluded to this before, Chris, quality has two definitions. One is the absolute value of the product, on a cupping score, is it a 90 or is it a 70? That's an absolute value. That's the quality rating for the coffee. But quality is also, and this is where I spent most of the time in the beginning of the conversation, is talking about adherence to specifications. So, and this is where, when you're delving into really fundamental quality topics, you can say, this is a high quality coffee, but it's not in quality because it's too good for what the standard is. And adherence to standards is consistency and uniformity. High quality coffee. And this is where we go from, you have a menu of products that you're selling, and that menu is what you have available to the consumers every day. And hopefully you have a supply chain that gives you consistency Your buyers are looking at the price, the quality, the availability, the relationship of the coffee, and they're managing the blends and the supply chain and all the details as a professional coffee buyer has to manage and how complex that is. But then you look at what do we do with the really high-end, high-quality, exotic, esoteric coffees, the micro lots that are in really limited availability, but they have amazing flavors and they have amazing stories. Some of the Cup of Excellence coffees, for example. How do we merchandise and market them? And, in Vermont, where I live, farm to table is a way of life, and we know where all the food comes from in every restaurant, and there's a chalkboard that tells you where everything's from, and we love it. It's great. But that also tells you that when the produce changes, and when you go from summer harvests to winter harvests, when you go from different products, that the flavor of those products are going to change. The availability is going to change, because if we're sourcing locally, we don't have summer fruit, considering now that there's 2 feet of snow on the ground. If we keep coffee in a similar philosophy and say, we're going to have really great micro lot coffees, and we're going to tell you how this year's harvest tastes and how it's going to perform for you as a consumer. And we're only going to have this maybe for 6 weeks. And as soon as that 6 weeks are up and the inventory is gone, we're going to have something else that's really interesting and special. And that's where quality control needs to make sure it's meeting expectations. That's where merchandising needs to make sure that you're communicating correctly and truthfully and authentically, realistically to the consumer. And operations and product development can make sure that they're maximizing all the flavor attributes for those coffees so that it does taste the best way that it possibly can. And then making sure that once that inventory is depleted, you have enough sourcing and enough ability to make sure there's always going to be different coffees. And that means knowing the harvest cycles, so getting the coffee fresh from harvest, and making sure that you're lining up all your coffees several months in advance based on availability so that you can manage through that. Or, if you're a larger company, you have a couple of these exotics that are merchandised correctly. And then you maybe have a couple of your regular everyday coffees that you can guarantee that you have them in stock on a regular basis and they're going to be consistent. But I think you go back to, we do a disservice to our consumers by not reminding them that this is an agricultural product that's going to change throughout the harvest cycle. And the coffee year to year is not going to taste the same. They may not realize that because of the way that they're consuming it and how frequently or infrequently they're drinking the coffee, or the really minor subtle changes that happen month to month over time. Or they may realize it and say, this doesn't taste the same way that it did last year. Why is that? But it has to be, now we go into customer service, has to be a conversation, and it has to be an honest conversation with the customer or the client, which is saying, yeah, it's not really the same as last year. It may be better. It may be not as good, but we work really hard to make sure that we're getting the highest coffee available for our customers, and remind them it is an agricultural crop. And then you can then reinforce your quality control programs to make sure that the value of the coffee is consistent with your expectations. You're eliminating any coffee from your supply chain that does not meet your standards for grade. You're looking at bean size. You're making sure defects don't come in. Your quality control and processing is measuring your moisture, your water activity, your grind particle size, your roast defects, either your color or your roast development level. You're looking at testing the coffees and the different brewing techniques to manage from the density of the coffee going into the brew basket to the rates of extraction and how well it meets your total dissolved solids, to make sure that you know what's happening in your coffee before it gets to the consumer. Worst thing you can do in any business is operate by chance and, just blindly saying this is what we're doing and whatever happens, happens. It's, I can kind of consider that, the chef or the home cook who puts all the ingredients into the pot, makes dinner, puts it on the table and eats it, and is surprised at how it tastes because they didn't taste along the way or they didn't measure along the way. We shouldn't be leaving things up to chance.
Right. And so, in a sense, this is a question that I had also, which is, how does, practically speaking, how do we marry the robust analysis and quality control measures with dynamic feedback from our customers? And I say dynamic because, coffee changes per year, per harvest. And we're in a quest to sort of know what we're getting, like you're saying. But then there's the feedback of the consumer that influences what we're going to be looking for, and that seems like a give and take. So practically speaking, how do we set up our systems to be able to not just hear our own minds in this, but to also leave room for iteration over time?
So there's a couple different ways to answer that, Chris. And I'm going to first start by saying, we want to be able to test through quality control, through quality testing, to make sure that we can record the attributes of the coffee so we know what's happening in manufacturing, in the supply chain. But the testing has to be based on what's controllable and what's actionable. So actionable meaning if all we're doing is collecting data and putting it on spreadsheets, and the spreadsheets go in folders on the computer, or they get printed out and put in 3-ring binders onto the shelf and we take no action, we're just collecting data, that's not necessarily quality control. That's just data collecting. So I'm going to move it forward and say, if we have the data that we know the attributes of the coffee, physical and sensory, when customer complaints come in and they say something is different, that's, your customer service side and your sales side to say, consider the source. Is this a customer that just complains a lot? Is this a big customer that's influential? Is this somebody we don't know and they're just kind of giving their opinion that maybe they didn't like it, but it's not necessarily bad? So it's still a good coffee. It meets standards and expectations, but maybe they just didn't like it. So trying to categorize the complaint as it comes in, if you have your quality control data, when they're saying something's different, you can go back to the data and say, no, everything that we had that we controlled is exactly in standard, in specification. Maybe there's something uncontrolled. If it's a cafe, then you can go back and say, okay, did we follow all of our quality control and process control techniques in the cafe to make sure the brewed beverage was the way that it was supposed to perform in front of the consumer? Did we clean all the equipment so it was in like new condition at the beginning of the shift? How long, if it was brewed coffee, was it in the shuttle or on the burner before they received it? There's a lot of different questions. Was the milk spoiled on the condiment bar? There's a lot of questions. So quality control makes sure that we have enough of the data collected so when the complaints come in, we know what action to take. We can't control everything. We don't want to control everything because we don't want to spend too much resources and too much time collecting data that I said is not actionable. It has to be a kind of holistic approach to what am I doing and what's the impact of what I'm doing and how is that going to affect the business to make sure that what we're selling meets the expectations. So there's a lot of, what I talked in the beginning, there's a circle. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? How are we doing it? Looking at from a business perspective forward and a customer perspective backwards. And we don't want to be wasteful. We don't want to be hysterical with quality control that we're, spending so much time and resources collecting so much data that we don't know what to do with it. So let me take a step on operationally for quality control is the beginning of the process. And I think roasters can understand this is the specification will tell you in the very beginning what's acceptable, what's unacceptable, so that when you're doing your data collections, when something's bad. What I've seen in the trade is very often you get folks who don't establish the minimum and maximum standards. They don't know what's acceptable or unacceptable. They collect data and hopefully they can interpret the data based on their testing to determine whether they should use it or not. Those determining factors should always be identified before you start doing testing. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. And I think when I'm hearing you talk about this, the idea comes up that I hear from clients, and I hear this just online sometimes. It's the art of roasting coffee and the intrigue of being a roaster. Sometimes it's a shock just the way you're talking about this doesn't sound like we're roasting coffee. You know what I mean? It's very mathematical. It's very scientific. There's a lot of work to this. And I just want to roast coffee, Spencer, to be honest with you. And I'm sure that's something a lot of people feel. And so I guess the question is, as we kind of round out the conversation here, is that like taking the first step to really embrace quality control in a practical way for our roasteries, because we're not all going to be able to afford tons of equipment. But if we had to like purchase certain pieces of equipment or undergo certain tests and things like that, where would you advise people start their journey to making quality control a actual part of their operations?
So we don't want to create a massive shopping list, because the shopping list can be long and can be really expensive. So the first real question is, are you evaluating your results against your suppliers or against your customers? And are you being held to standards and specifications? If that's the case, then you want to make sure you're having the same equipment and following the same methods of testing as the folks who are going to be evaluating your results and evaluating your coffee. Because if you test it differently, or you're following a different method of analysis, or you're using a different tool, sometimes the results are not going to correlate. And you're going to say, well, according to my numbers, I'm getting X. And then your customer or your supplier are going to say, well, we tested it and we're getting Y, and you don't know which is the right way of doing it. So it really depends on what questions you need to answer. And in roasting, some tool to be able to measure with some scientific precision either the color of the coffee or the roast development of the coffee. If you're grinding the coffee, there needs to be some kind of measurement to evaluate the roast particle size. If you're packaging the coffee, I'm hoping that you're nitrogen flushing so that you're offsetting the oxygen and not allowing the coffee to stale within the package. You should have some kind of headspace analyzer to measure the oxygen and the carbon dioxide inside the headspace. Scales. I should have said this first. Scales. Selling any product on net weight is one of the few things that are regulated by the government. So understanding what the Bureau of Weights and Measures requirements are for net weight testing, making sure you have scales at the right sensitivity, make sure you know how to calibrate your scales on a regular basis. And if you're using your scales for commerce, make sure you're following the state guidelines on having them certified by the state. That's critical. So that's really your starting point, but I cannot say enough how important it is that when you're testing and operating your equipment, that your equipment has to be calibrated to a standard. And you have to follow the manufacturer's guidelines of operating that equipment and selecting the equipment that's appropriate for your business as compared to the other folks that are looking at it. So if you're doing any kind of private label, understand how your private label customer is evaluating the coffee. And if you're using a different tool than they are, your numbers aren't going to be the same. Then you have to form some type of alignment. So there's a difference between calibration and alignment, kind of a pet peeve that I have, because I think we as in the industry use these terms completely incorrectly. But if you have two tools with two different measurings and two different reports or data that they're going to report out, you have to make sure and test minimum, maximum acceptable levels and what the alignment of those two machines are to make sure that you know when you're in spec and out of spec on your tool, because it's going to be measured differently with a different tool. And calibrating is making sure that your equipment is operating to a standard, which is based on manufacturer's guidelines, things like that. So on that manufacturing, a lot of it's going to be based on what you're selling and how you're selling it. If you want to start on the green coffee side, making sure you have the appropriate screens in order to test bean size. Make sure you're trained, so it's not a tool, but it's a training on grading the coffee. Make sure you understand how to test for moisture of the coffee. And now we're going to dive a little bit into primary methods and secondary methods. So a lot of the tools that we use in the coffee business are secondary methods. It's a It's a technology that measures something very quickly and conveniently, but is not the published scientific standard by AOAC or ASTM or ISO, where they're using primary measuring tools to measure agricultural products. A lot of the tools that we use are secondary. They're calibrated to the primary method. So I'll give you an example. In the lab that I work at, we use primary methods. So when we're measuring moisture, we follow an AOAC method where the coffee goes into a vacuum oven at a specific vacuum pressure, at a specific temperature, at a specific time. And following those protocols, the results are accepted as standard because we're following the peer-reviewed, scientifically published method. If you're using a secondary method, which is electric capacitance testing, which a lot of the tools that we use in coffee use, those machines have to be calibrated so the results are consistent with the primary method. So understanding what method you're using for testing, is it controllable, and then making sure you're operating that equipment accurately and correctly is critical to any quality control program. But let's go back to what you said in the very beginning, making sure you're not wasting money on tools and equipment for testing that is not what's necessary for your particular business.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think we have definitely, what the term might be pocket science in terms of how we explain certain aspects of coffee. We do this with milk science, we do it with espresso and other things like that. And I suppose that something is better than nothing because not all of us can have a vacuum oven, right? So calibration well received as advice because we calibrate our grinders, we calibrate our espresso machines. And so obviously if we're going to do quality control, we have to do QC on our QC equipment as well. And I feel like all this pursuit on the back end in the roastery is the kind of thing that kind of trickles into the rest of the organization. So you're more likely to actually get a little bit more detailed on what you're measuring or accounting for in your maybe a retail expression, for example. So you just kind of it multiplies and it creates a thing where now you can really track things well all the way down to where the customer drank the coffee, what time of day, all that stuff, because you want to make sure that you can replicate a great experience.
Correct. So think about the consumer and they're brewing coffee at home. We in the trade use scales and we measure and, we're putting everything to an exact science and we're using stopwatches and, temperature probes and thermocouples and things like that. That's what we do when we're brewing coffee because we're professionals and we kind of geek out on it because we know what we like and we want to control it. But your regular everyday consumer, hopefully they're cleaning their brewer on a regular basis, maybe not. But most consumers are using scoops, which is volume, not necessarily mass. And they're just blindly scooping it in half asleep in the morning. I'm going to use 6 scoops and fill the water and push the button in and make my pot of coffee. If we're not actively controlling or measuring the grind particle size or the grind particle size distribution between all the different screens, that same scoop from that same can with the same amount of water in the same brewer is going to taste different because the rate of extraction is going to be different. And then they're going to complain. And the financial risk back to the company is these guys don't know what they're doing. The coffee tastes different every time I buy a can or every time I buy a bag. This is bad coffee. I'm going to go buy somebody else's coffee. And it's only because the company didn't invest in a way to measure and control the grind particle size. They're just hoping that, I always set the grinder. It's always set on number 6 and it's fine. But what you don't realize is grinders, the burrs in the grinders dull over time. And as the grinder vibrates, things loosen up. And even if the burrs are the same sharpness over time, those burrs are going to get a little farther apart because, screws don't tighten themselves through vibration. They always loosen. And that number 6 on the grinder that you always set it at is not always going to be the same grind particle size over time. That has to be managed and controlled. And that's quality control. Testing on a regular basis, knowing when you need to say the burrs are getting a little duller. Instead of a 6, now we got to do a 6.5 in order to get the same result out of the machine because it's grinders are one of the things that are not calibrated. They're only aligned to a standard, aligned to a grind level, because there really aren't too many standards in grinding, unless you're doing measuring based on particle size, or you have a row tap and you're doing the amount retained in the different screens, and you can say, that's my standard, I need to calibrate the grinder back to that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's challenging, it's expensive, but we want to make sure that we're providing the product to the consumer to meet their expectation, that we're communicating what we're doing. I mean, you need to get benefits to your business to say, look at all this time and effort we're putting into making sure the products look, smell, and taste the way they're supposed to, but also making sure that when a complaint comes in, that you have enough data to say, did we make a mistake? Is there a problem on our side? Or is it maybe a misunderstanding on the consumer side, or something that's beyond our control? There's a lot of business questions that come into play. But what you said earlier, I want to get back to, I want to just roast coffee. Coffee's fun. Coffee's exciting. I've been a coffee taster for more than 25 years, and I love that aspect of the business, tasting coffee and understanding the sensory attributes. That's we talk about the artistry. We talk about the entrepreneurial spirit and why coffee is still such an exciting industry for people to get into. And they love it because I drink coffee every day. Coffee seems to be a fun business. I want to open up my own coffee company. That's the exciting part. But then it comes down to the business management, the financial management, the measuring, the quality control. That's the nuts and bolts that really aren't exciting and sexy. But in order to be a profitable business, there has to be some kind of controls that are thrown in there. So what becomes, the passion, the excitement, and, from the entrepreneurs getting in, really becomes, that's the artistry. And as you mature into a ongoing business, the artistry of coffee is really the blending, is really the product development side. Because just about everything else is measured in science.
Well, I think it's true to say that if you're profitable, you're having more fun.
Yes.
Well, Spencer, this is a really awesome conversation, and I'm really thankful for your insights here and the work that you do. I think we've gotten a lot out of what you've shared today. So thank you for being on the show and talking about this with me. Where can people stay in touch with you and read more about what you do and your thoughts?
Well, it's my pleasure. I'm glad you invited me on the show. I enjoyed this. So I am very active on LinkedIn, and I own the Specialty Coffee Professionals group on LinkedIn, and I try to keep topics in the discussion that are relevant to coffee quality, coffee supply chain, the external environment, things like that. Anybody in the coffee industry can always reach out to me. My email address is Spencer, SPENCER @ce.coffee. The company I work at is Coffee Enterprises in Heinsberg, Vermont, coffeeenterprises.com. I love talking to people about coffee. The only thing I like more than talking about coffee is drinking coffee.
Very appropriate. Well, Spencer, thank you again. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Have a great day. Take care.
Well, I hope that you found that to be a very useful conversation, and it sparked a lot of thoughts of what you could do to take your quality control in your roastery to the next level, and maybe just quality control in your entire operation. Again, I think my main takeaway from this is that we have to find consistency and predictability as much as we can within the systems that we operate in, whether you're a small mom and pop shop with one, maybe two locations, or you've got locations in multiple cities. You have to figure out how to gain consistency within your ecosystem. And I think what Spencer has outlined for us, both in the audio article and in this conversation, is going to really help set you on the right path to making sure that your customers are getting a great experience every single time, and that your experience is also a satisfying one, and one that you know you can reasonably repeat. So a big thank you to Spencer for being on the show today. Be sure to get in contact with Spencer via email or on his LinkedIn account. And you can find out more information about where he works and what he does over at Coffee Enterprises by visiting the website coffeeenterprises.com. So if you have any questions or comments from me, make sure to send those to chris@keystotheshop.com. That's CHRIS @keystotheshop.com. Always welcome comments and questions, feedback about these episodes. And you can also use that to contact me if you're interested in Keys to the Shop consulting. And that is the end of our episode today. Thank you for joining me on another episode of the Rate of Rise series, brought to you by Roast Magazine and their audio articles. Have an amazing weekend, and as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.